Hello and welcome to Opening Doors podcast. Today, my guest is Christi Smith. Dr. Christi Smith analyzes and presents objective policy solutions through publications on criminal justice issues, including over-criminalization, parole and probation, community supervision, and reentry and reintegration. She works at R Street, and before that, she had dual careers in academia and in community supervision, spanning 2 decades. She served as the interim department chair, academic graduate program director, and assistant professor of criminal justice studies at Delaware Valley University. And additionally, her practitioner experience includes working as an adult probation and parole officer, specializing as a domestic violence investigator, forensic mental health specialist, a drug court officer, and interstate compact officer in the suburban Philadelphia area. She's also an executive committee member on the Bucks County PA Reentry Coalition, which is how we met, and the HEAL PA Criminal Justice Reform Action Team. She received a doctorate in public safety with a specialization in criminal justice from Capella University and many other degrees. Today, I want to talk with her a little bit about her experience at working as a parole officer and how that led her to her studies and why she's dedicated her life to helping people understand the implications of incarceration. Welcome, Christi.
Thank you so much for having me here.
You're very welcome. So give me a little bit of the background of what it was like working as a parole officer and how that led you to your master's and then doctorate program.
So the first thing I'll say is that I was a student, criminal justice student in the mid-1990s, which was, kind of the height of our get tough on crime era. And as a new probation and parole officer, when I began my career in 2001, we still had a lot of those ideas that, punishment was the way that we had to go instead of, really kind of encouraging and empowering people. And through my work as a drug court officer, which is a less adversarial process, one in which there's more of a collaborative effort between the probation and parole department, the public defenders, the district attorneys, the bail department, and service providers to really get to understand the person that was, before us and what their needs were and how we could best serve them. And it was through all of those stories that, I was hearing a lot from the female people that were under supervision, but men as well. And just learning, how they came to the attention of the criminal justice system was really through their experiences either in experiencing childhood trauma or adult trauma. And so that kind of began a shifting in my perspective of how we can most effectively work with people. After I transitioned out of probation and parole and into academia, I became a lot more aware of the research behind adverse childhood experiences, how that influences behavior, and how individuals who don't have the resources or support that they need to address that trauma may be more likely to come into the criminal justice system. At that time, I also had a number of colleagues in the field that were, either abruptly exiting the field, or they were quiet quitting, or they seemed to be burnt out. And so when it came time for me to work on my dissertation, I decided to study stress and burnout among adult probation and parole officers. And it was through that work that I learned not only that the clients that we were working with and that they had experienced trauma, but that there are a myriad of ways in which the system itself can impart trauma on individuals, but then those officers that are supervising them were also experiencing vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. So I really looked at it as kind of a holistic approach to, how is trauma impacting the people that are coming to the attention of the legal system? How is the legal system imparting trauma on not only people that have committed offenses, but also victims and witnesses? But then how are those collective experiences then imparting trauma on the officers that are supervising them?
That was actually one of the first times I heard you speak was around your work with Heal PA and how important it is not only to treat the trauma of the victims and the perpetrators, but also the care providers. And it's interesting, one of my other guests, Dr. Omar Rada, wrote a book on that topic, on how important it is for the people giving the care or the people that are professionally continually being re-traumatized in that space, that how they need to take care of themselves. So can you speak to a little bit about your work with Heal PA?
Sure. I became aware of Heal PA through the initial meeting with the Bucks County Reentry Coalition. Robert Reed, who's with the Attorney General's office and who also leads PARC, which is the Pennsylvania Reentry Council, had come to speak about the trauma experiences and the efforts for the entire Commonwealth to really make the progression of individuals through the criminal justice or legal process more trauma informed. There was a really impactful speaker there who shared her experience, which was just another vivid reminder of the experiences that lead people into the system, and then how the system, can either work with them to empower them and inspire resilience, or how it can, have harmful outcomes if the people are continually re-traumatized by supervision practices. So Rob and I have collaborated now for over 5 years in really not only trying to make the criminal justice process more trauma informed, but in raising awareness and education of the importance of it and how it's not only beneficial for the individual outcomes of the people under supervision, but also how it can mitigate and reduce trauma on the officers that are supervising them. You had mentioned service providers, and it's incredibly common in psychology or sociology or social work degrees for those students to be aware of self-care practices and to understand the increased likelihood that as a service provider, they're going to be absorbing, the collective trauma of the people that they work with. That's not how it is in criminal justice. There's this school of thought, or at least a previous school of thought, that, you had to have thick skin, you had to be tough, you had to handle it. And the reality is, while you have one individual that you're working with that, they have their trauma experience, as the officer, you have an entire caseload. You may have 50 to 100 to 150 people, a large proportion of which may have experienced some trauma either prior to coming to the legal system, or by virtue of their incarceration, or by virtue of their reentry. And so in this work, we do try to lead with the benefits of the professionals, and how using a trauma-informed approach is really going to be beneficial for these professionals in reducing their own secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma.
So for people that don't have experience with it, can you give the listeners a little bit of an understanding of what a trauma-informed approach entails?
Trauma-informed approaches seek to realize the widespread impact of trauma, including the vicarious trauma experiences of the people that are working within the system, and then to kind of open up the paths of resilience. You really can't move forward and be on a path of resilience until you can accept and acknowledge the ways in which this work might be traumatizing. So recognizing and realizing it is really kind of the starting point for that. And then recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma among anybody that you interact with, your colleagues, victims, the clients that you're working with, families, staff members, anybody who you interact with could be experiencing either an acute trauma or cumulative traumas that have built up either during that day or through the course of their work. And then once you can, realize that trauma is playing a role in this, and you're aware of what the signs and symptoms are, then we try and respond by really fully integrating our knowledge of trauma into our policies and our practices, and also our physical spaces. One of the lowest hanging fruits is to kind of, soften the environments in which people are being supervised, or in which victims are coming in to meet with a probation and parole officer or law enforcement or any other official, so that the environment is less sterile, less re-triggering, less re-traumatizing. And then, resisting re-triggering and re-traumatizing, in every single interaction that we have with a person, whether it's a verbal interaction, whether it's a physical interaction. That's what we're really trying to raise awareness and education and advocate for with HEAL PA.
So what are some of the signs and symptoms that people can recognize when they're working with someone who has been traumatized, or recognize about the trauma that they've themselves experienced?
Any significant behavior change. So for some people, it's gaining weight. For some people, it's losing weight. For some people, it's sleeping more. For some people, it's sleeping less. Some of the traditional hallmarks are increased alcohol or substance use. People who are really kind of quick to rise to anger. That's a very typical sign and symptom of trauma or a trauma response. Conversely, individuals who have already, kind of experienced all of these traumas may shut down, where you're asking a person a question and they're simply unable to answer it. Some people will avoid eye contact. The signs and symptoms of trauma are really, there are some global definitions, but they're really specific to that individual. And so, particularly among your colleagues, you might notice nuanced behaviors that are different than what they have been before. Someone who was always on time is now chronically late. So some of those things can really be indicative of a trauma response.
Thank you. Yes. And let's talk a little bit about the idea of over-criminalization. You touched on that a little bit as far as your time in the 90s. And I know that your work with drug court is a response to that, to over-criminalization. And I was fortunate to speak with Judge Boylan about recovery and mental health court. And I just think that they are the way to go. So
yes.
If you can speak to that a little bit about how over-criminalization has led to a bloated criminal justice system.
Sure. Yeah, drug court started in the 1990s, and I always call my initial experience in working with the drug court a blessing and a curse, because I agree with you. Specialty courts and problem-solving courts are the way to go, not only because they're a less adversarial, more collaborative process, but because they recognize the individual, they support the individual, they have, swift and certain graduated sanctions, so the outcomes are a little bit more predictable. And then when I transitioned out of drug court into traditional supervision, it's the exact opposite. It is an adversarial process. It's not collaborative. There is less attention to all of the dynamic needs that somebody has when they're coming into the system. And when you don't understand those needs and you can't fully support the individual in addressing them, they're more likely to continue cycling through the system. Probation and parole violations can lead to increased incarceration. The more you experience incarceration, the greater risk you are for future incarceration. The more you cycle through the system, the more difficult it is for you to actually get out of the system. And so beyond all of the get tough on crime policies that led to a bloated system, we're now paying a lot more attention to probation and parole practices, and specifically revoking supervision for technical violations, meaning no new crime, you missed appointments, you tested positive for something, you missed treatment, and then people being incarcerated for those things, and how that actually can thwart their progress and get them further away from the resilience that we need.
Yeah. And get them further away from really trying to stay on a path that's outside of the criminal world. I mean, if they feel that there's not much of a chance for them to lead a life that isn't going to throw them back in jail, well, then the criminal, it's a lot easier to stick to what you know.
Yeah. I mean, it does. It disincentivizes them. And, there's a common perception among people under supervision that probation is a trap, because, we have 25, 26 different conditions that are placed upon individuals, often, especially in Pennsylvania, for really long periods of time, 5, 10 years. And it does, in many ways, it does feel like it can set somebody up for failure. So you can understand, why somebody might not be as inclined to change their behavior if they don't feel that the system is supporting them in those efforts.
And what kind of work is being done to make changes to that, to sort of lessen some of those strictures, those?
So Pennsylvania passed a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill in December of 23 that was implemented sometime this summer, I believe June, in which they suggested making the conditions of supervision specifically tailored to the individual and to the reason that they committed crime. Also, a presumption against incarceration for technical violations of supervision. And if under certain circumstances, incarceration for a technical violation is warranted, they're capping the number of days or the length of time that can be sentenced for somebody who's going back to jail as a result of a technical violation. There's also a presumption for concurrent instead of consecutive sentences, because as I mentioned, Pennsylvania has historically had some of the longest terms of supervision across the country and previously had the fourth highest number of people on community supervision, whether it was pretrial, probation, or parole supervision. So really trying to shrink the footprint, but strengthen those supervision practices, and also looking at things like compliance incentives, where if somebody is, completing their conditions of supervision, they're doing everything we're asking them to do, having, either annual or biannual case reviews so that we can look at the potential for somebody to either go to a non-reporting status, a phone reporting status, or to actually terminate their supervision early after they have served, at least half of their sentence and done everything we've asked them to do.
That's great. I mean, one of the things that I know in speaking with people that are formerly incarcerated, that it is such a burden, the strictures of the supervision. What do you think is happening in reentry that is going to be the most helpful?
Reentry coalitions are definitely a benefit, and one that we have underutilized in years past. So, kind of getting the individual agencies and the service providers out of their silos and having them better collaborate together, which can really, provide that feedback loop, reciprocal sharing of knowledge that helps us better support an individual instead of relying simply on that individual for the information. Now we have, a little bit more of a collaborative process. So reentry coalitions, I think, are critical. Also, just raising awareness of the role of trauma and how we can encourage people and empower them so that they can engage on a path of resilience instead of, continuing to cycle through the system. Some of the other work that I do pertains to the use of fines and fees and how escalating fines and fees can contribute to somebody staying in the system longer than is necessary, particularly if they're indigent and they're not going to have the ability to pay, but that they may or may not be incarcerated for non-payment. If it, some people experience driver's license suspensions as a result of not paying fines and fees, which then prohibits their ability to get to work.
Get to work, right,
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
And if they can't get to work, they're not going to be able to have housing, and it's dominoes. Yeah.
And then the other work that I do that I'm incredibly passionate about is Clean Slate automated record sealing. So
Nice.
after somebody has the one thing I want to point out with record sealing and publicly available records is that individuals who have been arrested but not formally charged, or have been charged but have not been convicted, those records are still available to the public, which is going to limit their opportunities. And
Wow.
they've not
Okay.
legally been convicted of anything. So, that's going to be a barrier to their access to suitable and stable employment, education, housing, all of those resources.
So just being arrested will put something on your record.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And unfortunately, publicly available criminal or arrest records are notoriously, they're either inaccurate, They're incomplete. They're difficult for the general public to understand. General public doesn't know what an arraignment is. They, may not understand what it means to have charges dismissed or null prossed. So, somebody's presuming that just because a person was arrested, that there was a formal law violation when in fact they've not been legally found guilty of anything. And then for other individuals that have been convicted, but who have served their time and they've remained law abiding in the years that follow, that record is still acting as a barrier. And as I previously mentioned, all of the things that we're asking people to do while they're under supervision, if they have accomplished the Herculean task of completing the conditions of their supervision and they've remained law abiding in the years that follow, that record should not still continue to tether them to the legal system and to prevent their access to the things they need to remain law abiding.
Right. Their access to work, their access to housing, all of that. So, and I know that in recent years, Pennsylvania has made the ability for people to get a pardon a lot easier. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So the thing about pardons, and this is not specific to Pennsylvania, but pardons often still remain on your publicly available record. So when President Biden issued the mass pardons for cannabis offenses, pardons signal full forgiveness, but the record is still available online.
So then you need to do the next step, right?
Well, for some jurisdictions, you can. For the federal government, there's no process to petition to have your record taken offline. So there are only 4 jurisdictions, 4 states and the federal government that don't have any processes or provisions for individuals to have their records sealed. The vast majority of the states allow individuals and have allowed them for 50 or more years to petition the court to have that record sealed from the public purview. However, a minuscule percent of the population that's eligible take advantage of that because it's expensive, it's time consuming. They don't understand the likelihood of their outcome. So why would I spend time and money seeking to get my record sealed when it may not happen? They may need to hire an attorney, which is cost prohibitive. So Clean Slate automated record sealing allows different states and the federal government to establish an eligibility criteria. For which offenses can somebody be eligible to have their record sealed, and what is our wait time? How many years do we want to wait after they've served their entire sentence so that we can establish that they are in fact law abiding. And then they use the technology to then identify and automate the record sealing process so that, people don't have to, the burden's not on the individual to petition the court.
Right.
It's done for them.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that really is. That takes that whole pardon and expungement process and says, look, you did what you had to do, and now we're going to do what we need to do, which is let you be free from all of this from the past because you submitted to all of the necessary things and you're law abiding and that's wonderful. So, so the Clean Slate automated record sealing, is that, is it in process? What's the status of it?
12 states have already passed Clean Slate automated record sealing legislation. There are another half dozen states that have active campaigns to do so. And then there are other states that for any state that has legalized or changed the legal status of cannabis may have also implemented legislation that is specific to clearing cannabis offenses. So, at this point, the vast majority of states have some type of legislation that seeks to automate the sealing process for certain offenses, whether it's just specific to cannabis or it includes, low-level misdemeanors, low-level nonviolent felonies, arrests that have not resulted in conviction or summary offenses.
Okay. And what about Pennsylvania? Where's Pennsylvania in the process?
Pennsylvania is the leader. Pennsylvania has often been, Pennsylvania is often, and I had nothing to do with this. So, Pennsylvania's journey into Clean Slate preceded my time at R Street and my work on Clean Slate legislation. But Pennsylvania passed the first Clean Slate law in the country, and that was in 2018. It was supposed to go into effect in 2019, but was impacted by the pandemic. And The Pennsylvania law has since been expanded twice. We're now on what we call Clean Slate 3.0 in Pennsylvania, which has expanded the eligibility criteria to now include nonviolent drug felonies. So Pennsylvania used an incremental approach that initially began with summary offenses, arrests that didn't result in conviction, and some very low-level misdemeanors, and then has gradually expanded not only the eligibility criteria, but the original law, I believe, the person had to pay all their fines and fees first. The second iteration got rid of that requirement. Also, the first iteration of the law didn't provide a mechanism to notify somebody that their record had been cleared. And if you've been knocking on doors, for 5-10 years and those doors are always closed, you're not going to continue to knock. So the second iteration involved a notification process, and also allows us a greater ability to study the outcomes for individuals that have had their records cleared.
Sure.
The original school of thought was to not have it be so stigmatizing that we know whose records have been sealed, but that makes it difficult to study how those people, have how
been able to take advantage of that,
exactly.
how that's impacted them positively, so that the whole idea of record sealing can continue to be pushed forward.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you so much. You are so amazingly knowledgeable.
Thank you.
And I've learned a lot, and I'm sure listeners have learned a lot. I know that some of the work that you do is, especially with Heal PA, is available to people for free. So people can actually, I will put some links in, go to Heal PA and take some online courses for free to learn about how trauma impacts behavior. What about people that are interested in the, not necessarily even the automated record sealing, but in learning more about how they can get their records sealed? Is there any place that you can recommend, a website or?
Sure. The Clean Slate Initiative has a wide variety of resources. Record sealing is currently at the state level. There have been bills introduced at the federal level that have not yet advanced. But the Clean Slate Initiative really has a wide variety of not only resource availability, but also the personal stories of individuals. And it also gives an update on the states that have passed legislation, the campaigns in other states that are seeking to do so. So I would say the Clean Slate Initiative website is really kind of the best place to start for that. But if you are interested in your eligibility, either through petition-based record sealing or automated record sealing, you would have to look to your specific state.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Christi. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. Any nugget you want to leave the audience with?
Sure. I mean, I think we've all experienced trauma in some capacity. The pandemic itself was kind of a collective trauma that we may have experienced, even if a person didn't lose their job, their day-to-day activities were disrupted. And that's really challenging. And so, either small traumas that accumulate or major traumas that kind of land with people it changes your brain chemistry. It influences the way that you see the world. It influences the way that you interact with individuals. And so simply being aware of that really is enlightening in how you want to interact with someone and how we can best take care of ourselves. But from a reentry perspective, I think it's really important for the individuals that are supporting the reentrant, whether it's a spouse or a parent or family members, friends, just to understand the ways in which trauma can influence someone's decision-making and ultimately their behavior. So the more knowledgeable we are, hopefully the less likely we are to re-traumatize people who are already trying to engage in the process of healing.
Thank you. That is an amazing point and so important because as a family member of someone who was a reentrant, and family members want to help, and often not understanding that that the person who's coming back, they're free now. Shouldn't they be okay? That there is so much trauma just from having been incarcerated and having to sort of stay tough during that time, to be able to understand and to learn more about trauma so that you can support yourself and your family member that is reentering. That's so important. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah,
I
my
really
pleasure.
appreciate it. I really appreciate your time and all your knowledge. All
Thank you
right.
so much for having me here. This has been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you.